one of the big subjects you touched on at the start was was Alzheimer's and dementia.
Yes.
And I have heard several people on this podcast tell me that they think of Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. Worldwide, there is a new case of dementia every 3.2 seconds. It seems like, I don't know if this is true, but is Alzheimer's and dementia on the rise?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it is. In fact, it went from not being even on the radar to being a top 10 killer. Now, it's interesting how people even die from Alzheimer's disease. It's a very kind of vague death. But yeah, Alzheimer's disease is one of the top 10 diseases now, certainly in the West. And I would argue it's because it has a metabolic origin. Now, one of the interesting things about Alzheimer's disease is we have spent billions of dollars on Alzheimer's research trying to identify the plaque. So just to set the stage here so that people listening can appreciate this paradigm shift that's occurred in Alzheimer's research. Originally, and even in many people still, people thought that Alzheimer's disease is the result of these plaques accumulating in the brain. These kind of little proteinaceous, little thick things that are preventing neurons from sending the signals throughout the brain for the brain to think and have normal cognition. And yet there are those of us, and I'm proud to say I have long been one of them, who has said that the plaque-based theory doesn't make sense. We have had drugs that have been available for human use for years that have effectively reduced plaques in the brain and yet did nothing to improve cognition. So that is an immediate challenge of the plaque-based theory of Alzheimer's. Even further, even beyond older than that evidence, when you would look post-mortem or look at tissue donor people who'd passed away, you would look at the brains of people who died with confirmed Alzheimer's disease at the time of death and look at the brain of someone who died without any evidence of any cognitive decline or any compromised thinking whatsoever. And you would be just as likely to find plaques in both brains. So whether the brain had Alzheimer's disease or not, you would still see plaques in the brain. So the whole idea that plaques mattered has long been controversial. And just to put a fine point on it before transitioning to the metabolic origins, about 2 or 3 years ago, they found out that the very first published papers that implicated plaque as a cause of Alzheimer's disease were based on fabricated data. So the scientists who published those first reports that led to the entire theory that Alzheimer's disease is plaque-based were called out as fraudulent. And indeed, all of it was fabricated. So the entire idea that Alzheimer's, and we have spent billions of dollars on studies to try to determine how do plaques cause Alzheimer's disease? Why, when we reduce plaques, it doesn't appear to help the disease? Because the plaques had nothing to do with it. That's just something that some brains have. Some brains have more of these little specks than other brains, and they don't contribute to Alzheimer's disease at all. Now, what kept rising to the top, and I would hope now is the dominant theory, is that people with Alzheimer's disease almost always have some detectable instance of insulin resistance, if not full-on diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Now, I will say personally, I don't like the term type 3 diabetes because it makes it sound like it's a whole new version of diabetes. To say it more succinctly and accurately, it is simply insulin resistance of the brain. And the brain is a very hungry organ. It is in what I teach is a trinity of high metabolic rate organs. That there are 3 organs in the body whose metabolic rate is so high that it just really sets it apart from everything else. And the brain is one of them. The brain has a very high metabolic rate. So this is a very hungry organ that needs a lot of energy all the time. But the brain is unique in that it primarily will only use 2 fuel sources, and I've mentioned them, namely glucose and ketones. But glucose, in that section of the brain that gets compromised with Alzheimer's disease, the glucose can't just come straight in. It needs someone to open the door for it. And that is insulin, of course, just like we described with the muscle cell, where in order for the glucose to go into the muscle, insulin had to come and knock on the door, if you will. And then the muscle, being a polite, responsive host, would open and allow the glucose to come in. The brain is similar. That in that section of the brain, it has doors that need insulin. It's locked until insulin comes and opens them. So even though glucose levels may be high in the blood, like in type 2 diabetes, you would think, well, the brain can just get all the glucose it wants. And yet it cannot, because it has insulin regulating the entrance of the glucose. And if the brain is insulin resistant, there's not enough glucose coming in. And thus the brain is forced to rely on the only other fuel that it can rely on, namely ketones. But the same person who's eating all the time to keep their blood glucose high all the time has so much insulin in their blood that they're never making enough ketones to fill the gap. And mind the gap. And the brain has an energy gap now, and where the brain needs, an amount of energy. I'm kind of acting it out for those that are watching, but the brain has a certain energy demand that it needs. And if there's a lot of glucose in a healthy insulin-sensitive person, glucose will fill all of that need. But as the brain becomes progressively insulin resistant, it cannot get all of its energy from glucose, and thus there's an energetic gap. And in the absence of ketones, there's nothing to fill that gap. And the brain says, well, I don't have enough energy to keep functioning as well as I did before, so I have to reduce my function, which manifests as a reduction in the ability to think and process. In other words, cognition goes down. But what's so interesting is I just got finished describing a scenario that scientists refer to as brain glucose hypometabolism, or a reduction in the amount of glucose the brain is using. There are scientists that measured this. We don't in my lab because we don't do these kinds of techniques, but you can actually infuse people with the glucose that you can take pictures of and see how much the brain is taking it in and metabolizing it. In Alzheimer's disease, the brain is not getting as much glucose, so they call that a hypo, or a reduction in metabolism of glucose. And as much as you and I are describing that scenario as relevant for Alzheimer's disease, you can essentially open up the book of neurological disorders and see the same thing. Depression has a brain glucose hypometabolism to it. Migraines have a brain glucose hypometabolism. Epilepsy and Parkinson's disease. So all of these disorders of the brain, of the central nervous system, the one thing they all have in common is the brain isn't getting enough energy from glucose. And another way of saying that is the one thing all of those seemingly unrelated brain problems have in common is that they all have some degree of insulin resistance. But then it's no surprise that they all benefit when ketones can swoop in to save the day. But that only can happen if the person is giving their body a break from the insulin long enough to actually start making ketones.
Really, really interesting on this point of Alzheimer's, because I don't think people have spent enough time talking about the link between insulin resistance and Alzheimer's. And one of the things I was looking at there was how many people with Alzheimer's meet the criteria for insulin resistance. And some studies have it at 40%. There's a study I found here that has it at 70 to 80%, which I wanted to cite. Exact percentages vary, but one example is a study in the Journal of Neurology in 2011 that found insulin resistance at approximately 40% of individuals with Alzheimer's. But another study in Alzheimer's patients sometimes found it to be as high as 70 or 80%. For instance, research by Dr. Suzanne Dilamonte at Brown University has drawn attention to the concept of type 3 diabetes.
Yeah, again, I don't love the term, but I appreciate the use of it, which is, it does suggest a metabolic origin. But even you look at those ranges, Stephen, you'd say, well, one was 40, one was 80. Boy, what a difference. I suspect a lot of that is just how did they measure insulin resistance?
Right.
If they were looking at the glucose, like so many do, you're just going to miss a lot of people.
Yeah, it's quite hard I think there's different criteria, right, for how one defines someone as insulin resistant.
Well, and that's right. That's because there's not enough training, which is at the beginning of the conversation, you asked my mission. One of my missions is to help people learn what to look for.
What do they need to be looking for?
Yeah, they need to be looking at insulin. So
is that easy to measure?
Well, it is technically easy to measure. It's just that we don't have enough systems in place to enable it. Like, again, if someone listening in the UK were to go to their GP and say, can you measure my insulin? In many instances, they literally can't get it done. The system just isn't in place to take it to the lab and measure it. Now, some do. I know some physicians in the UK who do so, and they have developed their own way of getting it done, and they're incredible advocates of this whole idea. But it is harder in the UK and in Canada, where the system is such that they have said, out of ignorance, but perhaps well-placed or well-intentioned, they will say, well, insulin isn't a marker that matters. It is. And if you're measuring insulin resistance, just to put things back to where we had talked about it earlier, many people with insulin resistance have normal blood glucose levels. It's the insulin that's high. And so I would say if a person can get their insulin measured, get it measured. In US units, if it is anything above about 10 microunits per mil, that's a warning. In UK units, if it's anything above about 40 picomoles, that's a warning. Insulin is high, you could have insulin resistance.
And you could be skinny.
Oh, yes.
And have insulin resistance.
Yes, that's especially depending on the ethnicity. Like if someone listening to this is East Asian and they say, well, I'm quite thin, I don't have insulin resistance. You very well could. It depends. Even in young women, a group out of Northern Canada, which is, of course, pretty far north, they found that even in young, healthy weight women with PCOS, if they compared them to their identically matched other women without PCOS, they were more insulin resistant in the other group. So anyway, that's my way of saying, even if you look at yourself and think, well, I'm kind of lean, I'm not insulin resistant, you very well could be.
Okay, so I've got a friend who's a woman who has PCOS.
Yeah.
And one of the things that she often says to me is that she gains weight easily. Is this true?
Oh, for sure. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if she does, because the fact that she has PCOS is not absolute evidence, but very likely evidence that she has insulin resistance, which would mean at any given moment, her insulin is at the risk of being a little higher than her non-insulin resistant counterparts.
So if she goes and gets the test done,
I bet her insulin would be high. And so all that would mean is, which is good. I mean, knowledge is power. And my hope would be that as someone goes and gets their insulin measured, and there are a handful of other tests they could also look at, but that's the most succinct, then it would be all the more impetus or encouragement to say, okay, I listened to Stephen and Ben, I really do need to start making some changes. And even in PCOS, there are reports that document the absolute reversal of the disease with nothing more than just dietary changes.
I was looking also a second ago because we mentioned ethnicity a few times, and it says, the research I was looking at says that East Asians have fewer fat cells and they're more resistant to obesity-related metabolic issues.
Well, that's second part of that statement is not true. They're more resistant to obesity, but they are like, if it's an interesting dichotomy because
okay, I got you.
Yeah, so they're more, you like to find a Japanese man who's as fat as the average American. Boy, you're gonna have to look. It's hard. It's hard, but to find a Japanese man who is just as much likely to get diabetes, type 2 diabetes, very easy.
Africans have more fat cells typically.
Yeah, so on that ethnicity, if now there's a lot of kind of wiggle room here, but on one end we'd have Caucasians, blacks would be right nearby. African ethnicities would be quite close to the kind of Northern European ethnicity. And then we would move through, and I don't mean to miss anyone here, but on the other end, it would be East Asian. And then sprinkled through that would be Latino. Latino would be somewhere in the middle, kind of Hispanic. And then other Southeast Asian and then East Asian, kind of on the worst end, or the least sensitive, or the most sensitive to their fat. The most sensitive to their fat. This actually is a concept that has been presented called the personal fat threshold, which is this really interesting idea born from a group in Australia suggesting that across every individual body, which of course is heavily influenced by both ethnicity and sex, like we'd mentioned earlier, a body is going to have a rate at which it can store fat in a healthy way. And then once that threshold is met, any further pressure to store fat will start creating insulin resistance. And that threshold is essentially how many fat cells do you have and how much room do they have? So if you have more fat cells, you have a higher fat threshold. You can get fatter before it starts to hurt you.
Does your fat distribution also matter here?
Because it does.
Different races, this research is telling me, have different fat distribution. It's saying that Africans have better fat distribution, lower visceral fat, and less metabolic risk because of that. Yeah. Caucasians, moderate fat cell quantity, more prone to subcutaneous fat accumulation, which is that's the fat around the organs.
Yeah,
right?
so Caucasians, so let's say Northern European, African, both store more of their fat subcutaneously, which is the fat just beneath the skin, or the fat that you can pinch and jiggle. That has an ability to expand more because there's nothing really to limit it. However, the other place for people to store fat is their visceral adipose, which is the fat that is tucked within the abdominal cavity, so tucked around the organs. It's sort of surrounding the kidneys and the intestines and the liver. That is an unhealthy place to gain fat. But an East Asian, all things equal, is putting much more fat there than they are subcutaneously. The advantage of subcutaneous fat is
Which is the fat on the outside.
yeah. So the
Like
fat
belly
beneath
fat.
the skin, the loose belly fat, the fat that can pinch and jiggle, that fat has a greater ability to make new fat cells. So as much as earlier you and I said fat cells remain static, for the most part they do. There's a little bit of wiggle room where it can go up, and that's purely subcutaneous.
And Hispanics have higher fat cell quantity, more visceral fat,
Yes.
and increased risk of obesity-related conditions.
Yes, and so the problem with visceral fat is this is such a finite space. There's so little room within the core of your body that if we allowed those fats to multiply, it could theoretically start physically compressing on tissues.
Right.
And so those fat cells only grow through hypertrophy, which is the thing we talked about earlier with slow insulin resistance. Subcutaneous fat cells are more abundant but smaller. Visceral fat cells are fewer but much larger. And so any ethnicity, including Hispanic or Asian, that promotes relatively more fat storage in the visceral space is going to suffer from the consequences of that fat much sooner. And again, it still comes back to size. The bigger the fat cell, the sicker the fat cell.
According to Alzheimer's Disease International, the total number of people living with dementia globally is expected to reach 139 million by 2050, which is up from around 55 million in 2020, which I imagine is in part related to people living a bit longer than they once did as
could
well.
be. Although over the past few years, life expectancy actually turned down for the first time in the history of modern world. So who knows if it will continue to go up. But yeah, it could be people are living longer. I mean, one of the effects of modern medicine is that people live longer with disease, Alzheimer's included. But it's absolutely a consequence further of our overall metabolic milieu that we put ourselves in a position where we're making our brains insulin resistant, and thus they're going hungrier and hungrier.
There's a study you talk about, which you've cited before, that shows that if you move visceral fat from an obese animal to a lean animal, this immediately caused insulin resistance.
Yeah, in the animal that received it.
Okay.
Yeah, so just to be clear, if we took what they did in this study just to reflect why or the different depots of fat are harmful. And so the human body has two distinct fat depots, and you and I described them: subcutaneous, which is the fat beneath the skin, or visceral, which is the fat tucked within the organs of the abdominal space. And if you move subcutaneous fat,
Which is like the belly fat.
the belly fat, and from one animal to another, you couldn't do this in humans. If you move belly fat, if you will, or subcutaneous fat from one animal to the other, the animal is very healthy. It's no problem. Subcutaneous fat is inert. It really is just sort of hanging out there and minding its own business. But in that same study, if you move the visceral adipose over, now all of a sudden that animal that got that extra dose of visceral fat is going to become sicker. It's going to become more insulin resistant and diabetic because you've increased its visceral fat, the amount of fat that it has in that space. The body wants to limit the amount of fat that it has there because if the fat grows too much, you can physically start compressing and squishing organs that you need to be functioning, like the kidneys and the intestines.
Have you seen Brian Johnson?
I have. I don't know him personally, but
You've seen the documentaries and stuff made about
Yeah.
him and the work that he's doing. What do you make of what he's doing to extend his age? Because, one of the subjects I think is linked to this is the idea of longevity
yeah.
in aging. And he's become a bit of a poster child for the subject of longevity.
Right. Well, I want to address this because this is a real person. So I want to address it very politely and diplomatically. I think that I want to distinguish the difference between longevity research and science, which is a very real, living, breathing field, and I'm proud to know individuals who are longevity scientists, and distinguish them from longevity, you said poster child, so the gurus of longevity, and that's not the same thing. So what I say, I don't mean it to be an indictment of longevity research, but I don't mind if people hear a bit of an indictment in my voice of the modern longevity guru approach. So these individuals, and he is certainly the most well-known, they do have the advantage of never really being able to be proven wrong. So there's an inherent problem here. But I will say that the application of being a longevity expert, or not a scientist, but a guru, and I don't mean for that to be negative, but it does have a bit of a negative sound to it, is that you have to rely on what I would call weak evidence. Now, what do I mean by that? So all of the approaches to longevity nowadays rely on either correlational studies or basic research or animals and insect studies, and then extrapolating that results or assuming those same results will apply to the human. So let me briefly just mention my concerns with correlational research. So the longevity guru will say correlational evidence suggests that people who eat meat die more. Well, a correlational study is, by my estimation, some of the weakest evidence that you can ever generate. A correlational study would just have someone come to your home and say, Stephen, can you please answer this survey about what you eat? You answered the survey. You may lie. You may not remember. You may have things that you don't even think about including, like, for example, that you're part of a very well put together religious organization. And I actually use that example very deliberately because people who are known to be part of good, tight social circles, like a formal religious group, always live longer than people who don't. Maybe you're really lonely. Loneliness is a greater contributor to death than cigarette smoking, and it's not even close. So there could be things on that survey that you just cannot capture, and yet we end up making a conclusion. And so all of that correlational evidence is deeply flawed research, and yet that becomes the basis for the longevity guru to determine diet.
So if I'm trying to extend my longevity,
Yeah.
trying to live longer, then exactly what should I be thinking about?
Yeah. So my view on longevity is a metabolic view. No surprise. I'm a metabolic scientist, and I don't mind someone sort of smirking at me declaring that or admitting it. But I'm somewhat justified. Just by way of setting the stage, the birth of the modern longevity research, if it didn't start, it was heavily influenced by the work of a woman named Cynthia Kenyon, Kenyon. Cynthia Kenyon was one of the she really did, in my mind, kind of give birth to the modern longevity focus. What her lab found using an insect model, and this is again a problem with the longevity gurus, is that they rely on insect data, for example, but it was compelling what she found. I think it was worms. She found in worms that if they restricted the glucose that the worms were eating, they would live 50% longer, or some fantastic increase in how long the animals lived. That kind of gave birth to the idea of fasting being beneficial, but it also allowed her lab to start playing around with some of the genes of these little insects. And when they started knocking down or underexpressing some of the genes involved in insulin, they didn't have to restrict the food. The animals just lived longer. And so that touches on this metabolic aspect. And everyone nowadays is really interested in autophagy. Autophagy is a term for a cell essentially cleaning itself out,
Which is typically associated with long fasting.
Yeah. In fact, yes. So that is partly why fasting has been so embraced within the longevity community. It's because if you can promote longevity, or autophagy rather, if you can promote autophagy, the cell keeping itself cleaned out, that is thought to be a key contributor to longevity. So autophagy equating to longevity. I don't disagree with that. I think that probably is a very valid view. Then the question comes, well, how can I control autophagy? Well, there is a humble hormone that comes from the pancreas that has a very powerful effect on autophagy called insulin. So as much as people are fasting, what's the value of fasting and reducing autophagy? It's because insulin comes down. Now, what becomes interesting is what happens if you were to put someone, allow them to eat calories, but the calories are such that their insulin is staying low and they're making ketones, in other words, a ketogenic diet. You also enable autophagy. There was a very well done animal study finding that they didn't have to restrict calories and fast the animals. They could let the animals eat as much as they wanted, but it was a ketogenic diet. They lived significantly longer than their other litter mates that were eating the normal high carb chow, similar to what humans eat nowadays. And so autophagy probably does matter for longevity. All the more reason to keep your insulin in check, because insulin is a powerful inhibitor of autophagy. So as much as we have longevity gurus who are taking thousands of dollars worth of supplements, I can't help but look at that and think, just control your insulin. That within every cell, there's this battle. There's a yin yang of growth and death, or building and breaking, to say it a little more politely. In fact, that is metabolism. The very word metabolism encompasses anabolism, which is anabolic or building up, and catabolism or catabolic, which is breaking down. The key to a healthy, growing, living cell is this nice ongoing balance of build and break, build and break. You have to build something up and then modestly break it down, and then you build some things up again. And autophagy is a very important part of that breaking cycle within the cell, that, hey, it's time to get rid of some old parts, and now we'll rebuild some of that again. Now we're going to break down these parts and rebuild it. Insulin is the key to that process. If insulin stays high for too long, you never allow the catabolic or the breakdown. This is one reason why insulin is so facilitative to cancer. Insulin wants things to grow. Cancer is a disease of growth. We don't ever let the cancer start to break down. Insulin won't let it, in part.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.